He was born in 1921 in a small Bavarian village surrounded by quiet forests, cold rivers, and farmland that stretched further than a child's eyes could see. His name was Martin Keller, a boy who never imagined that the world would, one day, drag him into the deadliest conflict in human history. His father, Otto, was a strict but just man, a farmer with hands hardened by years of work. His mother, Annalisa, was gentle, always humming old folk songs while working around the house. They had little money, but plenty of discipline. Martin grew up in a Germany broken by the aftermath of World War I. People stood in long lines for bread. Entire families slept hungry. Some nights, Martin would see his father staring at the empty fields, silently worrying about the future. But Martin was different from other village children. He was quiet, observant, and endlessly curious. He studied how machines worked, how people behaved, how the world moved around him. By age 10, he had already learned to repair tools, guide horses, chop firewood, and help in the fields. He was small, but he was strong. One winter night, his mother found him outside in the freezing wind, staring at the stars. "Why are you out here?" she whispered. Martin answered softly, "Because someday I want to see what exists beyond these fields." He didn't know it yet, but fate would give him far more than he ever asked for. By the time Martin Keller turned 18, the world around him had changed beyond recognition. Flags with black eagles waved over cities, posters covered walls, and boys barely old enough to shave were suddenly talking about war, duty, honor, and sacrifice, words too heavy for their age. Germany was moving fast and pulling everyone with it. The choice that wasn't a choice. In 1939, the letter arrived, a pale gray envelope stamped with the national emblem. Every family in the village knew what it meant before it was even opened. Mandatory conscription. Martin Keller was being called into military service. His mother cried quietly that night, trying to hide her tears while cooking dinner. His father said nothing, but Martin saw the fear behind his stern expression. Before sleeping, Martin placed the letter on his bedside table. The moonlight reflected off the ink. He whispered to himself, "I don't want war, but I will not run from what lies ahead." The goodbye. The day Martin left, the entire village gathered at the station. Small towns never forget their sons, especially the ones leaving for war. His father placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Remember who you are, son, even in uniform. Remain Martin." His mother hugged him tightly, her face buried in his chest. She slipped a small wooden cross into his pocket. "For protection," she said through trembling lips. The train whistle screamed. The engine roared, and Martin stepped into a journey that would transform him forever. Baptism of discipline. Training camp was nothing like home. The first morning, they were awakened at 4 a.m. by whistles that cut through the dark. Cold water splashed over their faces. Boots slammed on the floor. Orders were barked with no room for hesitation. Martin quickly learned how to assemble and clean a rifle in complete darkness, how to run with full gear for miles without stopping, how to obey instantly, without thinking, without questioning, how to silence fear deep inside the chest. The drill sergeants were merciless. If one man failed, the entire platoon suffered. Push-ups in freezing mud, marches through storms, endless repetition until all weakness was burned away. But Martin adapted faster than most, not because he was the strongest, not because he was the bravest, but because he was disciplined, steady, and calm, qualities forged in the fields of Bavaria long before he wore a uniform. A soldier's first friend. Among the recruits was a tall, loud young man named Erik Brandt. He was everything Martin wasn't: talkative, bold, always joking. On the first day, Erik slapped Martin's shoulder and said, "You look too serious, friend. Don't worry, war hasn't started yet. We still have time to laugh." They became inseparable. They trained together, ate together, shared letters from home, whispered at night about what the future might hold. Erik talked about girls, parties, and becoming a hero. Martin talked about his family, the farm, and machines. They balanced each other. One fire, one calm river. And though neither said it out loud, they both knew. When the war finally began, they would need each other more than ever. The moment of transformation. One night during field training, the recruits were ordered to crawl under barbed wire as live. Machine gun rounds zipped overhead. Tracer bullets tore through the sky. Mud clung to faces. Men screamed as explosions shook the ground. Martin felt the cold metal of his rifle, the sting of dirt on his skin, the taste of fear in his mouth. For the first time in his life, he realized war is not glory. War is survival. War is the end of innocence. When he reached the other side, breathing heavily, he looked around. Some men were crying. Some were shaking. Some stared blankly into the night. Martin just sat quietly, heart pounding. Slowly, he whispered to himself, "I will survive this, no matter what." Becoming more than a boy. After weeks of brutal training, something changed in him. His hands became steadier, his aim sharper, his resolve harder. He began guiding other recruits. When someone panicked, Martin helped them focus. When someone fell behind, Martin lifted them up. Even the instructors noticed. "Quiet one," they called him, but reliable. By the end of training, Martin Keller was no longer the shy boy from a Bavarian farm. He had become a disciplined soldier, a calm mind under pressure, a man prepared for the darkness ahead. But he had no idea how dark the coming years would truly be, because the world was marching toward a storm that would swallow millions, and Martin Keller was about to step directly into its heart. The summer of 1939 was supposed to be quiet. It was supposed to be like every other summer in Martin's life. Fields turning golden, river water warming, farmers singing while cutting wheat. But that year, Germany felt tense. Even the wind carried something uneasy. Newspapers shouted about Poland. Radios whispered about borders. People avoided eye contact when the word war appeared. And then, one morning, the sky over Bavaria changed forever. The day the sky grew dark, Martin had just returned from the fields when he heard it. A deep, distant thunder, not from the clouds, but from machines, engines, large engines. The entire village froze as shadows swept over the rooftops. Children ran inside. Women left their laundry in the fields. Old men stared upward with dread. And for the first time in his life, Martin saw warplanes, dozens of them, flying in perfect formation, cutting across the sky like steel arrows. Within minutes, rumors exploded across the village. They bombed Warsaw. Germany has invaded Poland. This is the beginning. Martin didn't fully understand politics, but he understood one truth. The old world was gone. A new world had arrived, louder, darker, and hungry. The first flames of war. That night, Martin sat by the radio with his family. The German announcer spoke with pride. Our forces advance victoriously into Poland. But outside, in the distance, they could see something horrifying. Smoke. Real smoke. Not imagination. Not a story. A nearby city, miles away, had been hit during a British reconnaissance raid. Martin watched the columns of smoke rise like black monuments into the evening sky. The wind carried the smell of burning metal, burning wood, burning fear. For the first time, he felt something he never felt before, a fear that didn't belong to a boy, but to a man facing history, the decision that changed everything. Days passed, each darker than the last. Radio reports grew more intense. More soldiers marched through the village. Every night, trains carried young men east and returned silent. One evening, Martin found his father sitting alone on the porch, staring at the road. "Father, are you worried?" Martin asked. Otto didn't look at him. "I am," he said quietly, "but not for myself. For you." Martin swallowed hard. His father continued. "War spares no one. You can't hide from it. Sooner or later, it will come for you." And for the first time, Martin realized he had to choose his fate before fate chose for him. A boy steps into history. The next morning, Martin walked toward the military office in the nearby town. His boots were dirty, his hands were trembling, but his eyes were filled with a strange, calm determination. The warplanes had left a mark not on the sky, but on his soul. He wasn't joining for glory, not for ideology, not for pride. He was joining because the world had changed, and he refused to be a boy lost in its shadow. He signed his name on the enlistment paper. Martin Keller, age 18, German Army, infantry, a small signature, but one that would carry him into the greatest conflict in human history. And as he walked out of the office, he looked back once at the rising smoke far away, the smoke that awakened him. Martin's first morning as a soldier did not begin with trumpets or patriotic music. It began with cold air, shouted commands, and boots stomping on frozen ground. He arrived at a training camp near Nuremberg, an enormous field surrounded by barracks, fences, and the constant echo of discipline. Here, boys became soldiers, and soldiers became tools of war. The separation from home. The moment Martin stepped through the camp gates, he realized a terrible truth. He wasn't a son anymore. He wasn't a farmer's boy. He wasn't even Martin Keller. He was now just a number, a uniform, a body in a machine much greater than himself. The first night was the hardest. No mother's voice, no warm farmhouse, no birds, only snores, boots, and the distant banging of late-night drills. But Martin endured it silently. He wasn't the strongest recruit, but he was stubborn, focused, and impossibly determined. The transformation. Training was brutal. Wake up, 4:30 a.m., march 20 kilometers, push-ups until collapse, rifle drills under the burning sun, snow drills under freezing winds. Recruits fainted. Some cried. A few even tried to run. But Martin pushed through every moment. His hands, once used for gentle farm tools, now gripped rifles, grenades, and heavy packs. His legs, once used for quiet walks across fields, now marched across mud, stones, and punishing terrain. The instructors were merciless. One of them, Feldwebel Kruger, yelled, "Pain is not your enemy. Weakness is. Kill the weakness inside you." Martin's weakness died that day. Making friends in hell. Despite the harshness, Martin found two companions who would shape his journey. Ernst Lukas Brenner, a tall, sarcastic Bavarian with laughter louder than artillery. He joked even during punishment drills. Zweitens Emil Rausch, quiet, intelligent, always reading, always thinking. He and Martin bonded like brothers. Together they survived. Freezing night marches. Gas mask drills. Bayonet training. Live fire exercises. Endless inspections. Each day, the three boys became less innocent and more unbreakable. The first taste of real war. One morning, the camp commander assembled all recruits in a long formation. His voice thundered. "Recruits, you are no longer boys. You are soldiers of the German army. Your first deployment begins in 1 week." A chill ran through Martin. This wasn't training anymore. This was real. War, frontlines, death, history. That night, Martin couldn't sleep. The room was dark, except for moonlight touching the wooden floor. He sat up, staring at his hands, now calloused, bruised, shaped by discipline. He whispered to himself, "I'm ready. I have to be." The goodbye letter. Before leaving, he wrote a letter to his mother. "Don't worry for me. I will come home. I promise." He sealed it with shaking hands. It wasn't courage. It wasn't pride. It was hope, a fragile hope carried by millions of soldiers in WWII. Marching into destiny. 1 week later, the recruits marched out of camp, full gear, rifles over shoulders. Martin Keller walked among them. He wasn't the strongest, not the fastest, not the loudest, but he was steady, focused, unshakable. As the train whistle screamed across the platform, Martin stepped into the carriage, leaving behind the boy he once was, and stepping into the fire of war. The train rattled through the cold morning, like a steel beast carrying hundreds of young men toward a world they had never seen before. Martin stared out the window, watching Germany fade behind him. Forests, farms, rivers, all disappearing into the distance. Ahead of him waited the Eastern Front, uncertain, unforgiving, unpredictable. It was the place where boys stopped dreaming and started surviving. The arrival. After 2 days of travel, the train screeched to a halt in a small, devastated Polish town. The station was half destroyed, windows smashed, smoke rising from distant farms. Dogs wandered the streets. Women hid behind doors. Children watched with empty, frightened eyes. Martin had never seen such silence, a silence filled with fear. Lucas whispered, "Welcome to war." First march through Poland. The soldiers marched for hours, mud sucking at their boots, cold wind slashing across their faces. Everywhere they looked, burned houses, abandoned carts, craters from artillery, roads torn apart, the smell of smoke mixed with wet earth. Martin kept repeating one thing in his mind: stay alert, stay alive. But nothing could prepare him for what waited ahead. The first encounter. Late afternoon, their unit reached a small village. The commander raised his hand. "Stay sharp. Enemy patrols nearby." Martin's heart pounded. He gripped his rifle tighter than ever. Suddenly, crack! A rifle shot echoed from the forest line. The entire formation dropped to the ground. Bullets tore through the trees. Martin froze for a second. Not out of fear, but shock. This wasn't training. This wasn't an exercise. This was the first time someone was trying to kill him. Lucas shouted, "Martin, down!" He hit the ground just in time as a bullet snapped past his ear. The firefight. German soldiers returned fire. Emil crawled beside Martin, loading a fresh clip, his hands shaking. "Small group, probably scouts," he whispered. Martin swallowed hard, aimed into the tree line, and fired his first real shot. He didn't know if he hit anything. He didn't even want to know. All he knew was that his heart had never beaten so violently. Within minutes, the small enemy group retreated. The Germans were left breathing heavily, covered in mud, adrenaline pumping like wildfire. The moment that changed him. After the firefight, Martin walked toward a ditch and sat down, trembling. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Lucas sat beside him silently. Then he said something that Martin would never forget. "Your first battle isn't the one where you fight the enemy. It's the one where you fight yourself." Martin nodded slowly, because he understood something crucial. War didn't just kill soldiers. It killed innocence. It killed the part of a man that still believed the world was gentle. The night of reflection. That night, they camped in an abandoned barn. Rain hammered the roof. Wind howled through broken windows. Martin lay awake, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling. His mind replayed the firefight again and again. The sound of bullets, the smell of gunpowder, the fear, the instinct to survive. He whispered to himself, "I must not break. Not here, not now." Stepping into real war. By morning, Martin felt different. Not stronger, not braver, just changed. The boy from Bavaria was fading away. The soldier of the Eastern Front was beginning to rise. With rifle in hand and mud on his boots, Martin Keller marched forward, deeper into war, deeper into danger, and deeper into the transformation that would define his life. The winter of 1943 fell over the Eastern Front like a silent executioner. Snow buried trenches, froze rifles, and turned every breath into a thin cloud of misery. For German soldier Erik Brandt, this winter was more than weather. It was a test of will, loyalty, and survival. The fortified village. Erik's unit, the 9th Infantry, had been ordered to hold a small, ruined Soviet village that barely existed on any map. It had once been home to farmers and families. Now it was nothing but broken houses, burnt roofs, and miles of white dead fields. For 3 days they waited for the Red Army counterattack. 3 days of listening to the wind howl like a wounded animal. 3 days of staring at the tree line where shadows moved. But no one knew if they were real. Erik kept his rifle close, warming his stiff fingers with his breath. His friend Klaus, a sarcastic machine gunner, tried to lighten the mood. "Maybe the Soviets froze to death," he muttered. "Or maybe they're waiting for us to freeze first," Erik replied. They both knew which possibility was more likely. By 1944, the war had changed completely. What had started as organized campaigns now felt like chaos. Cities burned. Trenches were endless. Survival was no longer guaranteed. Erik Brandt's unit was deployed to defend a strategic village near the Eastern Front. Once peaceful homes, barns, and streets now lay in ruins, scarred by artillery and air raids. Smoke rose like black pillars, twisting into the pale sky, while distant explosions made the ground tremble beneath their boots. The assault. The alarm sounded just before dawn. Artillery shells screamed overhead, exploding with deafening force. Men dove for cover in shattered walls and muddy craters. Erik pressed himself against a stone wall, rifle ready, heart pounding. The enemy was close, too close. Red Army soldiers surged through broken streets, moving with deadly precision. Bullets tore through the air. Smoke choked lungs. The smell of burning wood mixed with gunpowder. Erik fired carefully. Every shot a fight to keep himself and his comrades alive. Klaus shouted orders to their small squad, moving through rubble and debris to flank the attackers. Erik followed, feeling the ground shake with each explosion, adrenaline sharpening every sense. Loss and resolve. Amid the chaos, Erik witnessed the first true death of a friend. Private Mueller, a fellow recruit he had shared bread and stories with, fell under enemy fire. Erik's stomach twisted, but there was no time to grieve. Survival demanded focus. The firestorm of war had no pause. It stripped away fear, replaced it with pure instinct. It forged Erik into something he didn't recognize, a soldier of steel, yet a boy still carrying the weight of grief inside. The night after, when the fighting subsided, the village lay in smoldering ruins. Survivors counted themselves, cleaned weapons, and searched for the wounded. Erik wandered through the streets, looking at the skeletal remains of homes. He could hear faint cries in the distance, the moans of the injured, and the despair of the lost. Lying against a crumbling wall, he whispered, "I will survive. I must survive. For them, for me. And for the first time, he realized the truth of war. It wasn't about glory or victory. It was about endurance, resilience, and the will to live. Winter had returned, harsher than ever. The front lines were shifting constantly, and survival no longer depended on skill alone. It depended on endurance, cunning, and the ability to navigate death itself. Erik Brandt's unit had been tasked with a dangerous mission: to escort a group of wounded soldiers and refugees across a frozen river, deep in enemy territory. The river was wide, its surface cracked with jagged ice, and any misstep could send a man plunging into freezing death. The escape. The night was silent, except for the occasional snap of ice beneath boots and the distant hum of enemy patrols. Torches flickered, illuminating pale, frozen faces. Each man carried not only weapons but memories of family, friends, and lives that now seemed impossibly distant. Erik led the group, moving cautiously. The river was a mirror of the sky above, black, cold, and unforgiving. Klaus stumbled once, nearly slipping into the icy current, and Erik grabbed him just in time. "Careful," he whispered. "One wrong step, and it's over." Danger in every shadow. As they progressed, the wind shifted, carrying sounds of movement, shouts, footsteps, the rustle of clothing. Enemy scouts were near. Erik signaled everyone to stop. They pressed against the riverbank, holding their breath. Shadows blending with shadows. Minutes stretched into hours. Every second was a test. He could hear the terrified whispers of the refugees. "Are we going to die here?" Erik didn't answer. He couldn't promise anything. All he could do was keep moving, keep surviving. Survival through strategy. Erik scanned the surroundings, using his years of training to guide them. He chose the narrowest, shallowest part of the river, where the ice was thick enough to hold their weight. He distributed the weakest soldiers first, then helped the injured over with ropes and sheer effort. By dawn, they had crossed the river. Every man was alive, every life preserved, for now. Exhausted and frozen to the bone, Erik looked back at the river. It had been a barrier, a test, and almost a grave. But it had also been a lesson. In war, survival sometimes means moving silently through darkness and trusting only yourself and your comrades. The weight of responsibility. As the group settled in a nearby abandoned village, Erik finally allowed himself a moment to reflect. He counted heads, checked injuries, and reassured frightened eyes. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a guide, a protector, a leader born in fire and ice. And yet, in the quiet moments, when the night crept back, he felt the crushing weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Every life depended on his choices. Every step forward was a gamble. Every night could be their last. But Erik Brandt was determined to survive, no matter what. By 1945, the war had become an unending storm of fire and metal. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Trenches, craters, and shattered streets had become the new landscapes of Europe. For Erik Brandt, the battles no longer felt tactical. They were pure survival, a test of instinct, endurance, and willpower. The artillery raid. The unit had been ordered to hold a strategic village that overlooked a key supply route. At dawn, the earth shook under a relentless bombardment. Artillery shells tore through walls, sending bricks and dust into the freezing air. Smoke and fire twisted together, blinding soldiers and disorienting everyone caught in the chaos. Erik pressed himself against a crumbling wall, rifle ready, listening to the screams and explosions around him. The roar of artillery drowned all thought except one: Stay alive. Survive. Move. Brothers in arms. Around him, comrades shouted orders, dragged the wounded, and fired back at unseen enemies. Klaus, his lifelong companion through the front lines, was hit by shrapnel but still clung to life. Erik knelt beside him, bandaging his wounds as best he could while under fire. "Keep your head down," Erik shouted, pulling him to cover. Through the smoke and rubble, he saw Emil, their quiet strategist, coordinating their small group, signaling directions, keeping them from being overrun. War had forged them into more than friends. They were brothers of survival. The dance of death. Shells exploded with deadly rhythm. Every step was dangerous, every breath uncertain. Erik moved from cover to cover, crawling through mud, dodging debris, and returning fire when possible. The enemy was relentless. They had numbers, artillery, and the knowledge that desperation breeds courage. In this storm of iron, Martin, or rather, Erik Brandt now, learned to let instincts guide him. Calculations, strategy, or hesitation could mean death. Pure survival instincts dominated. Loss and resilience. By nightfall, the village was almost unrecognizable. Bodies lay scattered, comrades lost, homes destroyed. Erik counted heads. Some were missing. Some were gone forever. Pain, grief, and exhaustion weighed on him, but there was no time to stop. He whispered quietly to the survivors. "We're still here. That means we fight. That means we survive, one step at a time." The firestorm had stripped away every trace of innocence. The boy from Bavaria was long gone. Now there was only the soldier, the survivor. A moment of silence. As darkness fell, the unit dug shallow foxholes among ruins. They ate little, slept little, listened to distant explosions like lullabies of death. Erik stared at the cold sky, thinking of his village, his parents, and the farm he had left years ago. He thought of the boy who had once dreamed of seeing the world beyond the fields, and he realized, in the midst of fire and destruction, the world had changed him. War had changed him. By the spring of 1945, the war had reached its final, merciless crescendo. Cities lay in ruins. Forests had become graveyards, and the air was thick with smoke, blood, and sorrow. For Erik Brandt, the soldier who had once been a boy in a Bavarian village, every step now carried the weight of survival, loss, and memory. The final push. The unit was ordered to defend a critical crossroads near a shattered town. Supplies were nearly gone. Morale was frayed, and every man knew the end was near. Erik trudged forward, rifle in hand, mud and blood caking his uniform. Around him, the landscape was a nightmare of twisted metal, broken walls and shattered trees. The enemy was relentless. Tanks rolled in like living mountains. Artillery pounded without mercy, and the cries of the dying filled the air. Erik's mind was sharp, every movement calculated. Every decision meant life or death, not just for himself, but for the few comrades who remained. Brothers falling. Lucas, his boisterous friend since training, had been hit by shrapnel earlier that day. Emil, the quiet strategist, had taken a bullet in the leg but refused to stop guiding others. Erik's heart ached as he pulled them to safety, knowing there were no more reinforcements, no more miracles. For the first time, he understood the cruel mathematics of war. Every victory cost blood. Every step forward claimed life. The enemy closes in. By mid-afternoon, the town had become a death trap. Streets filled with rubble, smoke curling into the sky, flames licking broken roofs. Erik and his squad huddled in a ruined building, checking their ammunition and planning their next move. He thought of home, the farm, his mother's gentle voice, the boy he once was. And yet there was no time for nostalgia, only survival, only the next heartbeat. The last battle. The final assault came at dusk. Soviet tanks rolled across the horizon, infantry charging in synchronized waves. Explosions shattered the remaining buildings, and fire illuminated the horrors of the battlefield. Erik fought like a man possessed. Every shot, every maneuver, every breath was an act of defiance. He moved from cover to cover, dragging wounded comrades, returning fire, and keeping his squad alive for as long as possible. Time blurred, minutes stretched into hours. Pain, fear, and adrenaline fused into a single primal purpose: survive. The moment of silence, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ruined town. The fighting slowly subsided. The ground was littered with debris. Smoke hung heavy in the air, and silence fell. A silence filled with grief, relief, and the echoes of lives lost. Erik stumbled to the top of a small hill, looking over the devastation. He could barely recognize the world around him, and yet he was alive. Reflection and survival. In the quiet that followed, Erik allowed himself to remember the boy from Bavaria, who once gazed at stars dreaming of a world beyond fields, the friends who had fought beside him, some gone, some scarred, the lessons of survival, courage, and endurance he had learned in fire, snow, mud, and blood. He realized that surviving the war was more than staying alive. It was carrying the memory of those who did not survive. It was bearing witness, and it was living to tell the story of resilience in a world gone mad. The walk home. Erik began his long journey back through shattered towns and forests. Each step was heavy with sorrow and relief. Every face he passed was a reminder of humanity's cost. Yet, despite it all, he walked on. By the time he reached his home village, the war was over. Buildings remained, but the air was quiet. The fields were still, and the cold wind carried a promise of renewal. Erik stood outside the farmhouse where he was born. The doors creaked open, and memories flooded back. He was no longer a boy. He was a soldier, a survivor, a witness to history. And though the scars would never fade, he had endured. The legacy of Erik Brandt. The war had taken almost everything: friends, innocence, and time. But it had also given him resilience, strength, a deep understanding of survival and humanity. Erik Brandt's story became one of endurance, a testament to what a human being can survive, endure, and overcome. The boy who once dreamed of a world beyond the fields had lived through the most violent storm in history and had emerged, not unscathed but alive,